Well, welcome back, everyone, to our last installment of the 86th Psalm. This will be our fourth part, and I really enjoy looking at these Psalms slowly, but sometimes extra slowly, exploring the depths and the great truths and the principles that are in these Psalms. In our first three parts, we've covered the first 13 verses. Tonight, we're going to look at the last four verses to wrap this one up. Let's reread the first 13 verses, and then we'll start right in with verse 14. Psalm 86, a psalm of David. Incline your ear, O Lord, and answer me, for I am afflicted and needy. Preserve my soul, for I am a godly man. O you, my God, save your servant who trusts in you. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for to you I cry all day long. Make glad the soul of your servant, for to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. For you, Lord, are good and ready to forgive, and abundant in loving kindness to all who call upon you. Give ear, O Lord, to my prayer, and give heed to the voice of my supplications. In the day of my trouble I shall call upon you, for you will answer me. There is no one like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like yours. All nations whom you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and they shall glorify your name. For you are great and do wondrous deeds. You alone are God. Teach me your way, O Lord. I will walk in your truth. Unite my heart to fear your name. I will give thanks to you, O Lord my God, with all my heart, and will glorify your name forever. For your loving kindness toward me is great, and you have delivered my soul from the depths of Sheol. Let's begin with verse 14. O God, arrogant men have risen up against me, and a band of violent men have sought my life, and they have not set you before them. You know, it is always the arrogant who are against God, always the proud who stand with their chest out, with their head held high in defiance against God. These are the same proud of whom Jesus said in John 8:44, chapter 8, verse 44, rather, you are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. And who were these people who Jesus said was of their father, the devil? Were they the irreligious? Were they unbelievers? No. Not at all. They were Jews. They were the so-called followers of God. They were the sons of Abraham, as they referred to themselves. They had just said to Jesus a few verses earlier in John chapter 8, verse 39, Abraham is our father, which was to say to Jesus, how dare you condescend to teach us? Don't you know who we are? We don't need to be saved by the likes of you. We are saved by our lineage. And you know, there's no such thing. We can't be saved by our lineage. That's why Jesus replies to them, if you are Abraham's children, do the deeds of Abraham. And what were the deeds of Abraham? Well, the deeds of Abraham were simply to humbly, full of faith, obey everything that God told him to do. Let it be a warning to any of us who say that we belong to Jesus, that if arrogance is in us, to beware, because arrogance doesn't come from God, but it comes from the father of arrogance, the devil. So when David says, O God, arrogant men have risen up against me, a band of violent men have sought my life, and they have not set you before them. Now, we don't know who these violent men are that David is referring to, but we do know whose bidding they are doing, not God's. And David saying that these men have not set God before them, this is meant to be a contrast to David, who has set God before him. Note that David doesn't make any kind of claim either to be better than these men. The chief difference is that they are proud and they have no mind for God. And David has, despite all of his faults, he has humbly submitted himself to God. And that's the difference even today between Christians and non-Christians. Christians aren't better than anybody else. We aren't better because we follow Jesus from a moral standpoint, but we have been made right before God because of Jesus. And that's the difference. That's what makes all the difference. Verse 15. But you, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abundant in loving kindness and truth. Here David adds to his prayer another characteristic of God, among characteristics that he's already named. Now he's alluded to God's mercy in verse 5 already, when he said God is ready to forgive. In verse 3, he's already asked God to be gracious to him. In verse 5, again, he's previously said that God is abundant in loving kindness. In verse 11, David has said, I will walk in your truth. And he's added here in 15 this other wonderful attribute of God, slow to anger. I must admit that this is an attribute of God's that I desire most, yet struggle the most to obtain in my own life. And how I hate about myself that I am not slow to anger, but I think most people that know me well would say that I'm pretty quick to anger. I try not to be, but I still struggle with that. How glad I am, though, that God is nothing like me, but that he is described as, and is, in fact, slow to anger. Now, we may downplay, and often we do, how dangerous it is to get angry or to be angry with others. But Jesus taught us something very important about anger in the Sermon on the Mount. He said in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 and 22, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. You say, well, what's that mean, Wes? He's talking about murder there. Yeah, but look at the next verse, verse 22. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. So what's Jesus saying? Well, he was saying that your teachers have taught you to not commit the physical act of murder. And if you do, you're going to be found guilty by the court. That's good. That's a good teaching. It's a right teaching. But then he says, but if you are angry with your brother, you are also guilty of murder before God. And you will be found guilty in the only court that truly matters, his heavenly court. Anger is a dangerous thing. Murder is born of anger. And there should also be made a distinction here that God does get angry, but his anger is never wrong. His anger is never an unrighteous anger, which is the opposite of ours. Our anger is seldom a righteous anger. Our seldom is very seldom right. And you say, well, why, Wes? Why do you say that our anger is seldom right? Well, it's simply said, that we are sinners. And as such, we are always guilty before a holy and righteous God. And because this holy and righteous God is so gracious and so forgiving of us through the blood of Christ, and was so gracious and loving to us when we didn't deserve it, it is a minimum expectation of God's that we do the same, and that we are forgiving toward our fellow sinners when they sin against us. You know, it's impossible. It's hard for us to understand these things, but it is impossible for another person to sin against us in the same way that we have sinned against God, because God is always holy and we have never been holy. Long story short, though, before we get into too deep of theological waters, let's praise God along with David that God is not like us, but that he is slow to anger. And it's truly the only reason why we are still alive and breathing today, because God is slow to anger. Verse 16. David continues, "Turn to me and be gracious to me. O grant your strength to your servant and save the son of your handmaid." This request here, "turn to me," is similar to the request of verse 1. "Incline your ear, O Lord, and answer me." This turning of God toward a person is a similar request of God turning his face toward a person. It's a request for favor. This is simply a request of blessing or for blessing from the Lord. Then David requests God's strength, which is also important. It's important because it shows us that unlike a character, say like Samson, David did not grow arrogant and believe that the strength that he had was born of him or belonged to him. Now, David could have easily became arrogant like Samson did. He could have very easily became arrogant in his strength. After all, David killed a lion. David killed a bear. David killed the mighty Goliath. David performed great feats of human strength, but the wise man recognizes that any strength that he has comes from God. God who gives and takes away human strength by his will alone. Now, David knows that he has no strength apart from God, and so humbles himself before God and asks for God's strength. Again, we see him repeat that he is God's servant. Again, something that cannot be repeated enough. Something that we always need to keep in perspective, as David kept in perspective in his life. A right perspective before God, always viewing ourselves as God's servant, just as Jesus modeled for us and was the perfect servant of God. Then David says something very interesting in this verse. He says, "Save the son of your handmaid." Now, the cry to save him, that's not the interesting part. That's what he's been doing throughout the whole psalm. It's the next part that I find particularly interesting, where he says, "of your handmaid." Well, who's David referring to here? Who is God's handmaid? Well, it's none other than David's mother. It's interesting that both here and in Psalm 116, verse 16, that David makes reference to his mother and references her both times as God's handmaid. Now, we don't see David in his writings, we don't see David make references to his father, but we do see David make reference to his mother. And not only does he make reference to her, he makes reference to her in such wonderful terms. Where did David's knowledge of the Lord come from? Who taught the youngest son of Jesse to fear the Lord and to put his faith in him? It was David's mother. Praise God for women who teach others, who can be referred to as God's handmaids. Verse 17, David says, "Show me a sign for good, that those who hate me may see it and be ashamed, because you, O Lord, have helped me and comforted me." Now, on the surface, this appears to be something that Jesus taught was a bad thing. After all, in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 39, Jesus said to the Pharisees who asked him to perform a sign, he said, "An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign." Well, this isn't what David's asking for. And he's not saying to God, "Perform a miracle so that I know that you exist." No, what David means and what he's asking for is that God do something to show David's enemies that God is for David and is with David, so that David's enemies will stop trying to kill him. That's why David wants God to do this. It's not a sign for himself that he wants. It's a sign for those that oppose David, that are plotting to kill David. David's prayer, Psalm 86, is a great prayer for us to pray even today. In our world full of sin, seems to be increasingly getting worse, full of the seemingly endless enemies of our God, we too pray today for supernatural protection from those who set themselves up against us and against our God and against His church. And above all else, in this psalm, let the heart of our prayer life be verses 11 and 12. Teach me your way, O Lord. I will walk in your truth. Unite my heart to fear your name. I will give thanks to you, O Lord my God, with all my heart, and will glorify your name forever. Not only let this be our prayer, but let this be a reality in our lives. Until next time, church, love God and love others. I'm Wes LaFleur, signing off.